channel. It is Eponine, aka Epi, and today I am coming back with another true crime video. Today's video is going to be a solved case, so there's no mystery involved in this. We know exactly what the crime was. We know exactly who did it. After doing 5 cold cases, I wanted to go ahead and do something that did have an answer. I will say right off the bat that this case does involve child abuse. It is a pretty graphic case. And if that's something that could potentially be triggering to you or hard for you to listen to, I suggest that maybe you click out to a different video. I'll put some cards up here in case that's not subject matter that you want to get into. That being said, I will go ahead and do my normal little disclaimer that when I do these videos, I do not mean any offense or any disrespect to anybody who I talk about or anyone involved. All of this is information that I've gotten off the internet and I've compiled it into a neat little package. That way, if anybody's interested in this case, they can come to one place and find a lot of information about it. Now, I will warn you that today's video is going to be a longer one. This is a pretty detailed story, so you may want to grab yourself a snack and a drink. Let's go ahead and get into the murder of Sylvia Likens. In the summer of 1966, Sylvia Likens was a normal 16-year-old girl. She liked roller skating. She liked hanging out with her friends. She could often be heard singing the Beatles. That's her favorite band. In addition, she had a really close relationship with her younger sister, Jenny, and they had a really good bond together. Now, by October of that same year, so just a few short months, Sylvia Likens would end up dead in what became known as the single worst crime perpetuated against an individual in Indiana state history. So let's go ahead and hear how that happened. Sylvia Likens was born on January 3rd of 1949 in Lebanon, Indiana, to Lester and Betty Likens. Now, Lester and Betty were carny workers, so they worked at the carnival. And for those of you who don't know about that type of work, it's really undependable. The work is kind of far and few between. When it happens, you have to take the job and you have to go because you never know when your next chance to get a job would be. So Lester and Betty were working, but because of their financial struggles, because they had undependable jobs, all of their kids were not living with them. Diana, who was one of Sylvia's older sisters, had already moved off and she was married. Diana's twin brother, Danny, was living with Sylvia's grandparents along with her younger brother, Benny. So that left Sylvia and Jenny in the care of their mother. And all of this was going okay until Sylvia and Jenny's mom got arrested for shoplifting, and that left them without somebody to take care of them. Now, this stressed Lester out a little bit, and he wasn't totally sure what to do. So out of desperation, he put Sylvia and Jenny in the care of a woman that they never should have been with. And this woman's name was Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude Baniszewski was the mother of one of the girls' friends whose name was Paula. And at first, Lester could tell that this house was probably not a good situation for his girls to be involved in. The house was just very ran down. He could tell that Gertrude Baniszewski was very overworked and very exhausted. She had really bad depression. Her health was really bad. So she was actually described as just looking very skinny and haggard and like she was wasting away. Not only that, but there was already 7 of Gertrude's own children living in this house at the time. There was Paula, who was 17, Stephanie, who was 15, John, who was 12, Mary, who was 11, Shirley, who was 10, John Jr., who was 8 years old, and then a baby who was just a few months old at the time of the crime. Now, in return for taking care of Sylvia and Jenny, Lester agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week. And this was all Gertrude needed to say, yep, okay, I got you, I'll take care of your girls. Because Gertrude was very stressed out due to finances. She didn't make a lot of money. It was really hard for her to make ends meet. She'd had a lot of failed marriages. She was just a very depressed woman who had a hard time making it from day to day. So the thought of just taking on 2 more girls in her house, which was already honestly overridden with children, and getting some money for it, to her seemed like a great deal. It was an easy way to make $20 a week. And back in the 60s, that was a decent amount of money for not a whole lot of work. So all of this was going okay for the first week. Sylvia and Jenny were getting along well with the girls. They got along well with Paula. They got along well with Stephanie. They had known the girls from school. So things were going okay. Up until the day that the first check was set to arrive in the mail. And it did not come. Now this made Gertrude enraged. She had told the girls that she was taking care of those bitches for nothing. That was what she called them. She thought that Lester was just taking advantage of her and had left his children in her care and were not planning on paying her. So she actually took Sylvia and Jenny to the upstairs of her house and beat them pretty severely with a wooden paddle. And unfortunately for them, the check arrived the next day. So this abuse came for no reason, and it was just the beginning of starting to show the girls how horrible of a monster Gertrude Baniszewski really was. Now, it didn't take long after this date for Gertrude to kind of hone in on Sylvia, and they think part of this could have been because Jenny was actually stricken with polio, so she was partially disabled. She wasn't in the greatest health anyways, so they think that even though Gertrude was a horrible woman, that she maybe had enough common sense to know not to abuse the children who was already physically disabled. So she started to abuse Sylvia. And she started accusing her of lying. She started accusing her of stealing. She started accusing her of having sex with boys and just being very promiscuous. And none of these things were actually true. And a lot of these acts were actually things that Gertrude's own children were guilty of. So she decided to take it out on Sylvia. Now this got really bad when Gertrude's daughter, Paula, actually ended up getting pregnant. Not only that, but it's reported that she wasn't totally sure who the dad was. And this for Gertrude was just too much to take. But instead of taking it out on her own daughter, not that she should be abusing anybody, she decided to treat Sylvia as the problem. So this involved her kicking Sylvia horribly in the genitals to the point where it actually made everything swell up really bad and almost kind of closed everything off. I'll let you use your imagination on what all of that means. She started to hit her. She started to push her down the stairs. She started to just be horrible to her. And not only was it just Gertrude, but Gertrude actually started encouraging her own children to abuse Sylvia after a little bit, and then later got the neighbor kids involved. Now, part of the reason that one of the neighborhood boys named Coy Hubbard decided to help get in on the abuse of Sylvia. So Coy had heard a rumor that Sylvia had said that Paula and Stephanie were prostitutes. Now, Coy was Stephanie's boyfriend. So obviously when he heard this rumor and he heard that Sylvia was at fault, he got really upset and he decided that he could join in on the abuse and it wouldn't make him feel too bad about it because now at least he had a reason to justify his partaking in all of this. Coy Hubbard was trained in martial arts and he would often use Sylvia as like a judo dummy. So he would violently hurl her around the basement. He would hit her. He would deprive her of oxygen until he passed out. And he was just all around horrible to her. Now, this physical abuse, once it started, unfortunately didn't ever seem to slow down. The neighbor kids really kind of seemed to enjoy this abuse after a while. They would force Sylvia to climb to the top of the stairs solely so they could push her down because they thought it was entertaining to watch that. Gertrude Baniszewski would also put her cigarettes out on Sylvia. So it was reported that Sylvia had over 100 burn marks where cigarettes were extinguished on her bare skin. It was reported that she was forced on one occasion to eat a hot dog that was just loaded up with condiments and keep eating these hot dogs until she got sick. And then when she vomited, she was forced to eat the vomit also. In addition, along similar lines, there was times where she was forced to consume her own feces or urine or that of the Baniszewski baby, which not only is just disgusting, but is really, really unhealthy. It was also reported that on one occasion, Paula had beat Sylvia so severely that she had actually broken her wrist, her hand area, and it was placed in a cast. and that Paula went on to use that cast to beat Sylvia with later because it was actually a harder surface and inflicted more damage. So poor Sylvia was stricken with all of these physical injuries. And then in addition to that, she was actually forced to take scalding hot baths so that it would further injure her skin and just cause shock, essentially. The neighbor kids would rub salt in her wounds, so they would make it even worse. And then what I think kind of just takes this to the next level is that in addition to being really, really horrifically, emotionally, and physically abused, Sylvia Likens was also really, really tragically sexually abused. On 2 different occasions, Sylvia was forced to strip down naked in front of everybody and insert a glass Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina while everybody looked on and watched. Sylvia Likens was a virgin before any of this happened, so this wasn't something that was even remotely comfortable to her. This was something that was really, really physically hurt. And then I don't know if you recall earlier, but they had been kicking her in the genitals with great, great force. So her whole genital area was really, really injured. It was really hurt. And all of this abuse actually caused her to become incontinent, which means you cannot control your bladder. There had just been too much physical damage to that region, and she'd kind of lost the ability to hold her pee when she had to go to the bathroom. So she began to urinate on herself, especially at nighttime. And this just made Gertrude even more mad. So she started forcing Sylvia to sleep in the basement on the floor. She started forcing her to sleep naked. She rarely was allowed to wear clothes at all so that everybody could just look at her while she was naked. And to make things worse, Gertrude actually started to charge her neighbors like a 5-cent fee. So she would charge them a nickel to go down in the basement and just look at Sylvia and to help participate in the abuse and to call her names and to taunt her and to hurt her. And it's actually reported that Sylvia was so dehydrated and in such bad physical shape that she couldn't even produce tears to cry when she was upset. She, at this point, after a couple months of this horrific abuse, had essentially just started to give up hope. You know, when she first started getting abused, on multiple occasions, she would try to yell for help really loud. She would try to beat on the walls of the house, hoping that the neighbors would hear. And the really tragic part is that the neighbors report that they did hear some abuse going on, and they did notice that Sylvia looked really, really bad, but they just didn't really make it their problem, and they just ignored it. So the abuse continued. And it's even reported that one day at the park, Jenny and Sylvia ran into their older sister, Diana, who they had not had contact with for a long time. And this to them was great. They figured, we found our sister. We can tell her what's happening. We can tell her about this abuse, and she's going to get us out of this hell that we're stuck in. And instead, Diana just kind of assumed they were being overdramatic. They were being teenage girls. They just didn't like getting in trouble. And she didn't really help them that much. And I did read a report that once Diana was able to sneak Sylvia a sandwich because Sylvia was literally starving to death, and she kind of noticed that maybe things were kind of sketchy. But when Gertrude found out, she actually beat Sylvia, choked her, and then forced her to take another scalding hot bath. Now, there was one time that the health department did come to do an in-home check because of an anonymous report from a neighbor about a girl who was covered in sores who was living at Gertrude's house. And obviously they were talking about Sylvia. But when they arrived to do the investigation, Gertrude informed them that Sylvia had ran away. She was no longer living there. And the nurse simply left, unaware that Sylvia was actually being held prisoner in the basement and was in horrific shape. Now, on October 22nd, so a few months after all of this abuse had started, she was forced by John, one of the Baniszewski boys, to try to eat a burning hot bowl of soup with her bare hands. But she was just incapable of eating. The soup was really hot. She didn't have a spoon. All she had was her hands. I don't know if you can try to imagine eating like burning hot tomato soup with just your hands, but it's going to be really difficult. So once she was unable to really eat the soup, John took the bowl away from her. And for some reason on this day, the other kids making fun of her kind of seemed to make Gertrude feel a little bad for her. So Gertrude had kind of a change of heart and decided to let Sylvia sleep upstairs again and decided to let her sleep on a mattress. Now, when Sylvia laid down with Jenny, Sylvia asked Jenny, "Can you please go get me a glass of water? I'm so thirsty." And Jenny did get her the water, but unfortunately, because of that, Sylvia wet the bed and peed on the mattress. And this threw Gertrude into a fury. As punishment for this, once again, Gertrude took Sylvia downstairs and forced her to insert a Coca-Cola bottle into her vaginal canal. In addition to that, she had decided that because Sylvia had kind of branded their family as prostitutes and these horrible sinners and these horrible people, that she was going to brand Sylvia. Now, she took a pen at this point and wrote the phrase, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," on Sylvia's stomach. And once she had it written out and it was to her liking, she took a needle, like a pin, and forced one of her daughters to burn it, to heat the tip of it up. And then she started carving over her penmanship with a burning hot needle. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Gertrude was frail, she was sickly, she was haggard, she was in horrible health, she was a chain smoker. So after just a little bit of doing this, she started having a coughing fit and she was not able to finish. So she actually had asked one of the neighbor boys, Richard Hobbs, to help her finish the job. So Richard Hobbs admits that yes, he did put that phrase, he helped burn the phrase, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," onto a 16-year-old girl's stomach. In addition, him and one of the other girls named Shirley ended up taking like a poker that they had that kind of looked like an S, and they were going to brand Sylvia with that in the stomach as well. The burn ended up looking more like a 3 than it did an S, but they did cause further physical damage to Sylvia with this branding.
All I did was write out that thing on her stomach, and then I hit her about 10 or 15 times.
But how come?
Well, mostly because Gertie told me to.
Well, how about these scratch marks on her stomach? Who put them on her?
I did.
Why?
Well, Gertie just thought of it. She said, "Since you branded us, we're going to brand you." So she etched in with a pen, and I went over it. She showed me how to do it, and then I went over it. I did it.
Did you ever use any hot irons on her?
No. Yeah, that 3 on her stomach, I did half of that. And Shirley Ann did the other half.
Where'd the S come from?
What do you mean?
There's a big S branded on her stomach, right below one of her breasts.
Huh? That's what I'm talking about.
Well, that's what you're talking about. Well, how about the inscription on there, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it"? Who put that on her?
I did.
Did you scratch it on her, paint it on there? How'd you do it?
Well, like I said before, Gertie wrote it down there with a pen, and I did the rest. She showed me how to do it, and then...
Had Gertie abused this girl?
Yeah.
Now, after this attack, Gertrude would kind of make fun of Sylvia and just say that you are undesirable and no man is ever going to want you now with that carved into your stomach. And she was taken back to the basement after that point, where Coy Hubbard, who was the neighbor boy and Stephanie's boyfriend, proceeded to slam her body up against the wall 6 or 7 times with very extreme force. And it was that night that Sylvia turned to Jenny, her sister, and she told her, "I'm going to die. I can tell." She told her sister she didn't want to die, but she could just feel it, and she was going to die soon. The life was draining from her. So the next morning, on October 23rd, Gertrude Baniszewski forced Sylvia to write a letter to her parents, saying that she was sleeping with the boys in town, she was being promiscuous, she wasn't behaving how she should, and that the boys in town had actually mutilated her, and that's where her injuries came from. And after that letter was written, Gertrude started coming up with a plan on how she could dispose of Sylvia and just get rid of her forever. So on October 25th, Sylvia heard Gertrude's plan to blindfold her and to take her body and to dump it into a forest that was called Jimmy's Forest. and it was her plan to dump her there. Honestly, whether she was alive or dead, Gertrude didn't care. Now, as Gertrude was telling her kids this plan, Sylvia actually overheard her, and Sylvia got really scared. Sylvia Likens didn't want to die, and if she did die, she especially didn't want to just be left out in the middle of the forest. So she decided to take her last little bit of energy that she had and try to escape. However, her injuries were so extensive, and she was just in such bad shape physically that she couldn't even make it to the door before Gertrude caught up with her. So then after Gertrude caught her, she tried to force Sylvia to eat a piece of dry toast. Now, as I mentioned before, Sylvia was very, very dehydrated, so her mouth was very dry. Dry toast was not something that she was physically able to swallow. So as she started eating this, she started to choke on it, and she was just coughing really, really bad. So this made Gertrude even more mad, because Gertrude is a horrible woman who gets mad over everything. And Gertrude Baniszewski shoved the toast in her throat, took a curtain rod and beat Sylvia across the face several times with it, and then proceeded to throw her down the stairs. And then after she threw her down the stairs, she proceeded to hit and abuse her until Sylvia had lost consciousness. Now, once Sylvia regained consciousness, she did not have control over her body. She couldn't move her muscles. She really couldn't speak in any sort of intelligible manner. It was pretty apparent to everybody that Sylvia was getting close to the end of her life. And Sylvia could tell as well. So out of one final act of desperation, she tried to escape again. But before she could even reach the stairs, she just collapsed out of exhaustion. And Gertrude decided to physically step on Sylvia's head and then just stand there squishing her head with her feet for a little bit. And this actually started to cause some brain bleeding. So on the day of October 26th, so the day after all of this happened, Sylvia became unresponsive. And at first, Stephanie tried giving her CPR after realizing that she wasn't breathing. And this whole time, Gertrude was saying she was just faking it, and she told them to stop. And the kids realized she was really, really cold, and they decided to take her upstairs and try to put her in a warm bath, thinking maybe that would help. But it was in the bath that she stopped breathing and ultimately died.
Well, I'll come in and about, she come up from the basement, and we noticed she was cold and everything, so we carried her upstairs, give her a warm bath and artificial respiration. When she stopped breathing, we gave her a warm bath, and then she stopped breathing. And so I gave her artificial respiration for about 10 minutes. And then I went and called the police.
After a few minutes, it was clear to Gertrude that Sylvia was not faking it, and that Sylvia Likens, at the young age of 16, had passed away due to her injuries and her abuse. It was determined that she passed away due to a brain hemorrhage, shock due to the salt in the wounds and the hot baths and the burns, as well as malnutrition, dehydration, and just because of her other physical abuse that she had gone through. She was only 16 years old at the time. Now, after they discovered that she was dead for sure and that there was no chance of resuscitating her or bringing her back to life, she was bathed, like I mentioned earlier. She was then dressed up in clothes, which she had not been allowed to wear for a long time, and she was laid on a bed, which she was also not allowed to lay in for a long time while she was alive. Now, when the police arrived, originally Gertrude thought she had this all figured out. She gave the police the letters that she had forced Sylvia to write that said that the neighbor boys had came and brutalized her. So Gertrude's story was that Sylvia was a prostitute, was a horrible little girl. She didn't listen. She was very horribly behaved, and that she had recently returned home from running away, and that the boys followed her home, and that the boys actually abused her and killed her. And at the first, the cops had letters to prove that. They had the abuse on Sylvia, so they almost seemed like they were going to believe it until Jenny came up to them. And Jenny told them, if you get me out of here, I will tell you everything. So it was at this point that Jenny started talking to the police, and the police started to figure out what actually happened to Sylvia. So after Jenny and the police talked, all in all, Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Baniszewski, as well as Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were all arrested and charged with murder on different variations. Other neighbor kids named Mike Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Juke, and Anna Sisko were held for injury to person because of their involvement in the abuse, but they were not charged with murder at all. The 6 who were arrested for murder, the Baniszewskis as well as Hubbard and Hobbs, were all held without bail. After discovering her body and doing a full autopsy, it was found that Sylvia suffered from burns, bruises, muscle, and nerve damage, that her fingernails were bent backwards, and that the outer layer of her skin had essentially was gone and had peeled off due to being burned over and over and over. She had also bit through her top lip as she was dying, and her top lip was essentially gone. Her vaginal canal was so severely injured that it was essentially swollen shut. However, her hymen was intact, which means that she was likely still a virgin. Now, once the trial started, the stories between the parties involved differed greatly. Gertrude Baniszewski stated that she was not responsible for Sylvia's death, and she pled not guilty by reason of insanity.
I did never beat that girl, never. She was beat up on by other girls. In fact, my own daughter socked her in the jaw and broke her wrist. And so, I mean, there you go. And girls around the neighborhood beat her up, bloodied her nose. One girl broke her nose, in fact, I think.
Were you ever in contact with the police on any of these occasions?
Well, in the last 2 weeks, in fact, I think if you talk to my daughters, I'd ask them that the children's father and I are divorced, and he's a policeman in Leech Grove, or was. And I've asked the girls repeatedly to call their dad and ask him what to do. And in fact, I asked Jenny, I said, Jenny, and I told Sylvia, I said, Sylvia, I'm going to have to call the police or somebody because I can't have the responsibility.
She stated that her own children were out of control and that her own poor health, her depression, her poor circumstances, her failed marriages, everything like that just made her simply unfit to take care of her own children, much less somebody else's children. Now, the police thought, honestly, this was kind of BS because most of the children involved said that they only did what they did because Gertrude told them to do it. She was the adult in charge, so they kind of felt pressured to listen to her. Now, when 11-year-old Marie Baniszewski was called to testify, she broke down crying. And she really was the only person during this whole trial to cry and to seem to feel remorse for their part in this abuse. Marie was not charged with any crime because of her willingness to talk and her willingness to come forward. So even though she did play a part in the abuse, she actually got immunity because of her willingness to talk and to help put her mother in prison, essentially, and her siblings. So in the closing statements of the court case, Gertrude's lawyer did say, I condemn her for being a murderess, but I must say she's not responsible because she's not all here. And he pointed to her head, indicating that she was mentally unstable, so she was actually not at fault for the murder of Sylvia Likens. That was their legal route. However, the jury greatly disagreed. And on May 19th of 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. Now, she was spared for capital punishment, but she was sentenced to life in prison. Paula Baniszewski, her oldest daughter, who had been pregnant upon the trial and given birth to a daughter during this whole process who she named Gertrude, underwent the trial. She was charged with second-degree murder, and she was also sentenced to life in prison. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter and were all given sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years in prison. Stephanie Baniszewski was also granted immunity during the trial because she gave the police information, and so she did not receive prison time. And it's reported that after all of this happened, Stephanie Baniszewski went on to change her name, she got married, she had children, and she lived a relatively normal life. Now, Hobbs, Hubbard, and Baniszewski Jr. served 2 years at a reformatory, and right around 1968, they were all granted parole. So after less than 2 years in custody, they were all freely walking the streets. Now in 1971, just 5 years after the original court case, Gertrude and Paula Baniszewski were granted another trial by the Indiana Supreme Court. The reason was that they said there was too much publicity and just too much happening surrounding their original trial, so that they were unable to get a fair trial. Paula Baniszewski actually made a plea deal, and she pled guilty to manslaughter and was released 1 year later, even though she had tried to escape from prison multiple times. Gertrude Baniszewski, however, would not confess her guilt. She was retried, reconvicted of first-degree murder, and she was resentenced to life in prison. Now, over the next 14 years, Gertrude actually had pretty good behavior at the prison and became known as a mother figure, strangely enough, to the other inmates, and acted like a role model. She worked in the sewing shop doing work and helped the younger inmates when they needed guidance. She kind of helped them learn the ropes. And all of this helped her greatly when it came time to have her parole hearing in 1985. By then, the prisoners and the guards were regularly referring to her as Mom, and she had a really overall good reputation and a history of behaving well at this prison. A reverend actually came to her defense at her parole hearing and said that after her original trial, he would have given her the death penalty, but after talking to her, he's seen that she now lived as a good Christian woman and had repented against all of her sins. And on a 3-2 vote, even though the Likens family fought it, Gertrude was granted parole, and she was released from prison on December 4th of 1985. Now, before being released from prison, Gertrude actually changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen. Nadine was her middle name, and Van Fossen was her maiden name. And this was partially just in the hopes of leaving her horrors behind her and her prior life behind her. And after being released from prison, she moved to Laurel, Iowa. She lived there until her death on June 16th of 1990 at the age of 60. And Nadine Van Fossen / Gertrude Baniszewski died from lung cancer, and she died a lonely old woman. Her body was actually not discovered for about a month after she died. And when Jenny Likens saw her obituary in the newspaper, she cut it out and mailed it to her mom along with a note that said, "Some good news. Damn old Gertrude died. Ha ha ha." Now, Jenny Likens, who later did go on to get married and have a good life, took on the last name Wade after her husband, lived until June 23rd of 2004, where she passed away at the age of 54 due to a heart attack. Richard Hobbs, who is the boy who burned Sylvia on the stomach, died on January 2nd of 1972 at the age of 21 from cancer. John Baniszewski Jr., who became John Blake after this whole ordeal, made a statement after the West Side School Massacre, which is a school shooting that left 5 children dead, that not all child criminals are doomed to be criminals for the rest of their life, and he actually used himself as an example. It's reported that John Baniszewski Jr. went on to become a reverend and to actually kind of change his life around. And he lived until May 19th of 2005, where he passed away at the age of 52 due to complications from diabetes. Coy Hubbard, who was Stephanie's boyfriend and the one who practiced judo on Sylvia, became a career criminal, and he was in and out of prison for the rest of his life after his release. And he died at the age of 56 due to a heart attack. Now, Paula Baniszewski, the oldest of Gertrude's children, and the one who helped most with the abuse of Sylvia, assumed a new identity after her release from prison in 1972. She went on to get married, have 2 kids of her own, and was working as a school guidance counselor under the name of Paula Pace for 14 years until 2012, when her identity was discovered and she was immediately fired from the school district. The 4 neighbor children who were charged with injury to person had the charges dropped. They served no time. They had no punishment for being involved in Sylvia's death, and that was because their willingness to help out in the trials for the people who did have the murder charges. Now, it's unknown what happened exactly to Mr. and Mrs. Likens after the trial. While the trial was happening, they were there, they were actively participating, they wanted to see justice for their daughter. But after this trial ended, it's not totally sure what happened to them. There are rumors that they just went on to being carnival workers again, and life just went back to normal. So it's kind of unsure what happened to the Likens' parents after all of this happened. The house where Sylvia was murdered in stood abandoned for many, many years after the murder, with no one wanting to move into it because it was just kind of had a tarnished reputation at that point. For a while, people talked about turning it into a women's shelter, but they couldn't raise the funds. So on April 23rd of 2009, the house was actually demolished, and the location of the house is now a church parking lot. Now, in June of 2001, a 6-foot memorial was set up in Willard Park in Indianapolis to commemorate Sylvia and to just help people remember her. and several people attended this dedication. In addition, family and friends often meet up at Sylvia's gravesite to help remember her and keep her story alive. Even though she had a vicious, vicious death, they do want people to know about it, which is why it was important for me to make this video. Sylvia had to go through all of this. So even though it may be hard to listen to and hard to imagine, the bottom line is that for Sylvia, this wasn't her imaginative life. This was what she actually had to go through. So it is important to get her story out there and to share it. There have been a few movies based off of the story of Sylvia Likens. So if you are interested in this, I do encourage you to check them out. There is one that I have seen that had Ellen Page in it. It was called An American Crime, and it is very closely based to the story of what happened. It's pretty factually accurate. It's hard to watch, but it is really interesting. There's also another movie that is a little bit more dramatized, but it is called The Girl Next Door, and both of those movies were made to kind of help keep Sylvia's memory alive. So that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I know today's was a little bit longer of a video, but there was just a lot of the parts of the story that I felt were really important, and I didn't want to cut them out just for the sake of having a shorter video. So if you guys have hung in this far with me, thank you so much. Thank you for giving me a little bit of your day. I really appreciate it. That's a really awesome thing for you to do. And until next time, I love you all, and we'll touch base soon. Bye.